what we thought we'd do is kind of break this discussion down into three parts. The first one is kind of focusing on this report, Central Hill, a case study in estate regeneration. And what we're going to do in the first section is kind of look at, and I hope people in the audience who know more about this than I, will kind of look at the problems within current legislation, policy and practice in estate regeneration as they've been revealed by the report that we've written. In the last 3 years we've been trying to get architects to look beyond this very narrow brief, if you like, of what the parameters are, the duties of an architect. And I think the estate regeneration programme is making it more and more incumbent upon architects to take some sort of stance towards it. Then, in the third part, just to give this some structure, I thought we'd come back to specific things, specific issues, specific changes that we can start making demands or calls for, changes in legislation, which will then lead to changes in housing policy, which will then hopefully lead to changes in practice. Yeah. In a way, what we've got to, through our 3 years of practice, architects of social housing, we've got to a point where what we have been doing, we can't continue to do. It's not working, and we realise it's not working because of the sort of the current state of legislation and policy. And we realise that what our next task to do, so we haven't got enough on our plate, is not simply provide alternatives to demolition on these council estates which are threatened, but change legislation itself. I think quite a lot of people actually are working in housing history, realising that's what we have to do, that we can't simply keep on reacting to the current state. Okay, so in March 2015, when our Architects of Social Housing had just started up, we were contacted by the residents of Central Hill Estate, which is in Crystal Palace in South London. It runs along this beautiful tree-lined hill with extraordinary views of London to the north. Of course, most of the estates which are up for regeneration happen to be in these beautiful views, or be very close to lovely parks like President Gardens, or very convenient transport links. And they told us that they'd just been put up for estate regeneration, and they asked us to come in and work with them in their campaign to save their homes from demolition. Right from the beginning, they kind of knew, because of the widespread nature of this regeneration programme, the regeneration generally means demolition and redevelopment. Then Geraldine and other architects who came and worked with us spent the next year coming up with these alternatives to demolition, architectural design alternatives to demolition, of which you can see certain examples of many that were produced over the next year. And this, of course, came out of consultation with residents. I know this word now has got this sort of terrible kind of stigma attached to it, like so many of these words which are used around regeneration, like affordable housing, for instance, or consultation, or brownfield land. These words which have been kind of turned against themselves. But we worked with the residents who, of course, knew their homes and the problems with their homes and the benefits of their homes better than anyone else. And from that, Architects of Social Housing came out with these alternatives to demolition. We're not going to really talk about we may later on, about the architectural qualities of them, but we use this not simply to provide the residents with a tool for their own campaign, something they could use to say to the council, Lambeth Council, you don't need to demolish our homes. The reasons you're telling us that they need to be demolished are ones that we can address. And those reasons, as most of you know, are usually one, that they don't have the money to refurbish the homes because of central government cuts, and two, refurbishment wrote to address the need which comes from on high from central government to build more homes for our expanding population. Now, we came out with two very basic things, that we could in fact increase the housing capacity on this estate, as we can with the others, the 5 or 6 that we've done this for, by up to 50%. So there's 476 existing homes on Central Hill Estate. We can add 242, I think. Not only that, but by selling half of those, or renting, so sale or rent, preferably rent, on the private market, we could generate the funds to refurbish the existing homes, which have been neglected for many, many years. Then also, at the time, the other half of those homes, roughly, could be built as council homes, and therefore address the real housing need in London, which is not for two-bedroom properties selling for £640,000, but for sub-market rent. That's what the real demand is in London at the moment. So first of all, it was a tool for the residents to combat what the council was saying about why they needed to demolish their homes and rebuild new developments in their place, which almost none of them will be able to afford either to rent or to build. At the same time, though, we also wanted it to be part of a polemic in which we challenged the very, the precepts of the Estate Regeneration programme. One of those, which is voiced by councils from Conservative-run or Labour-run or even Liberal Democrat-run boroughs, is that because of central government cuts, councils cannot upkeep the estates. They can't afford to maintain them, therefore demolition is the only answer. And we have demonstrated very clearly that that is not the case. They also say that the cost of infill, of building in the spaces around the estate, or in our case, also building roof extensions, is prohibitive. Now, one of the things we did when we came up with these designs, we also got them costed by a quantity surveyor. And to refurbish all the existing homes, the 476 homes, and to build another 242 was costed in total, with all the other fees and on top, at £77.5 million. Okay? That's to refurbish all the existing estates up to the Good Home standard, as well as increasing the capacity of the estate by 50%. Now, what we worked out is that it will cost Lambeth Council simply to demolish the existing estate and replace every one of the existing homes. This is before they've actually built a single additional home, more than twice as much of that. I think it was £157 million. Okay? So before they've even increased a single new home on the estate, it's going to cost twice as much. The other thing that we did is we looked at the financial model being proposed by Lambeth, and it's not unique to Lambeth, a lot of councils are using this, particularly Labour councils, which is this special purpose vehicle that they're setting up called Homes for Lambeth. Now Lambeth spent a lot of time saying this is not a private company, it's a holding company which is going to be 100% owned by the council. But the council will effectively subcontract out the building, the construction, the management, the running of the entire new development to private subcontractors. We know some of those that are already. So the least that's going to happen with this new development that they're proposing on Central Hill Estate is that the entire place is going to become privatised. In fact, one of the things they're going to do is they're going to replicate exactly the management structures that led to the Grenfell Tower fire last year. So we looked into the social costs of demolition to residents themselves. And you kind of know what those are. Leaseholders are going to be offered about a quarter of what is required to buy a new equivalent property on the new development. They're going to go being from homeowners being turned into tenants with assured tenancies. And leaseholders, until they actually own 100% of the new home, they only have the rights of a tenant. In terms of residents, they've got what's called a right to return. It's another one of these phrases which is kind of bandied about. All that means is they've got the right to return if they can afford the increased rental rates. The other thing we looked at, so that's the social cost of demolition and redevelopment, is going to be pretty much the eviction of the entire existing community from the estate. The financial one, as we've seen, is that it's actually twice as much merely to replace as what there. The other thing we asked Model Environments, I don't know if there's a representative here, who are an engineering company, to come in and do an environmental estimation of the carbon cost of demolishing the estate as well. So we kind of wanted to boil down the cost of demolition and redevelopment to both its social costs to the existing residents, the financial costs both to them and the council itself, and also the environmental costs of demolition and redevelopment to the wider community. So, having done all this, having had the support of probably got something like around about 80% of the residents for our plan, we submitted them, or presented them to Lambeth Council. And very, very quickly, they rejected them. But the key thing they did is, when we asked to see the figures on which they had judged our proposal to be financially unviable, they sent us back a report which had 23 pages, which had been redacted. It looked like a kind of like a Malevich painting. And this goes on over and over and over and over again. Now, the reason for this, when we said, well, what's this? The reason for this, they said, was because Homes for Lambeth, this special purpose vehicle they're setting up, which will become the development vehicle for these new developments, because it is, even though it's 100% owned by Lambeth, it is a commercial vehicle, it's a commercial project. And therefore, all the figures associated with it are considered commercially confidential. But the thing is, they also said, because they're the same figures that we're using for your assessment, the assessment of your report, figures which they used to establish that our proposal was also apparently financially unviable, are also redacted as well. So this started a very long process, which kind of continues today, of us writing freedom of information requests to them, saying, why can't we see these figures? Surely this is in the public needs to know this. It's in the public interest to see these figures. And they just kept on rejecting us. We've gone through everything. We've gone through the Greater London Authority, the Information Commissioner's Office, asking to see this thing. Now, just so I can just kind of finish up here. This is kind of where we stand now with this proposal. They basically refused to give us information on which they rejected our report. Now, having spent about 2 years working with this community and developing these plans, initially we thought this is a complete disaster. We've kind of seen 2 years' work go down the drain. And then we thought, maybe this isn't a disaster. Maybe we can make something out of this. And that's when we started to work on this report, which contains not only the architectural design proposals, the alternatives to demolition that Ash has produced, but it's also a study or a report on how and why those proposals have been refused. And what it showed to us was that even if you have a completely financially, environmentally and socially beneficial and viable alternative to demolition, if the council don't want it, they don't want that, because that's not why they're doing it, they are completely free under current legislation to simply dismiss the proposal. So that means that if every estate of the hundreds and hundreds which are threatened with demolition had a group like Ash, with all the people who come and work with us, to draw up all these plans for free, it's still not going to make any difference at all. And that was kind of a real wake-up call to us. We thought, there's no point us continuing to go on and do this and come up with these proposals. And we thought, what else could we do? So what we wanted to do with this report is not only show that there is a design alternative to demolition, which is financially viable, which is socially beneficial, which is environmentally preferable, we also wanted to show how this is completely useless under current legislation. So we want to use this report as part of a polemic to start arguing that we need changes to legislation. Because at the moment, the councils, which has anyone worked with them, they are kind of little fiefdoms. They can always do what they want. They can simply reject this and push through the state demolition program schemes against the wishes of residents and against all the kind of the impact assessments that people like us can draw up.
My name is Michael Edwards. I'm active in a network called Just Space, which is a network of tenants associations, the London Tenants Federation, a lot of local and neighbourhood organisations and campaigning groups. Some of them are London-wide and some of them are local. It's been going for about 10 years, and what it does is that all the groups in it support each other when it comes to fighting battles on planning issues. Two or three things to say about it. One is that London housing strategy is based on what we consider to be a complete mistake, a complete misunderstanding. The misunderstanding is that the way to solve London's housing problems is to build the absolute maximum quantity of additional houses. It doesn't matter too much the price or who they're for, or even where they are. They're better off both near to public transport. Total quantity is the key thing. And the studies they've done of the needs of London, have to do by law, telling them that they need to produce, or London as a whole needs to produce 65 or 66,000 extra dwellings a year to meet the needs. That's between double and treble what gets produced at the moment. Now, I mean, this is a complete fantasy, completely irrelevant in our opinion. In our view, what's needed is a lot more social housing and low rent housing, which is what Simon said earlier. But this argument is being used as the bulldozer to drive through a whole lot of policies which are very dangerous. One of them is to haul all these estates, these council estates, into this programme of demolition and replacement at double or treble the density, but mostly not affordable. One new angle on it, which has surfaced in the last few days, is very interesting, which undermines the logic of this whole redevelopment strategy, is that if, suppose you've got an estate with 100 dwellings, and you demolish it because you say you're going to produce a new estate of 200 dwellings. Now, even if they were all going to be council rental, it's going to take between 10 and 20 years to get back to the position you were in before you started, because you demolish, so you reduce the stock, you lose the use of 100 dwellings for 2, 3, 5, 10, 15 years while you do the new scheme. And in the meantime, all the vacancies in the borough's housing stock have been gobbled up to decant and rehouse people temporarily while the thing is going on. So actually, this argument that we need more dwellings and this is the way to go doesn't really work at all. It really pulls the carpet. And this is a very helpful new way of thinking about it. The other important thing to add, I think, is an environmental impact. And this is referred to a bit in your report, that when you demolish an estate, particularly if it's a concrete estate, you basically throwing away all the embodied carbon content of that structure and doing a lot more environmentally damaging stuff by using concrete again to build a new one. And so the environmental impact tends to be extremely damaging on the whole. Much better to refurbish and renovate and repair than it is to demolish and replace. So I'll shut up now.
They've just released the Good Practice Guide for Estate Regeneration, and I think very much to kind of distract people's attention away from its content, they suddenly said they've done another consultation on this thing of balloting. And they're saying, well, if we can get residents' consensus over it through a ballot, then all the problems are over. And again, they positioned it very much in terms of not trying to ask what residents what they actually want to be done to their homes, but about getting a consensus. And there's a lot of problems with it. One of them, the most obvious one, is consensus over a ballot is every bit as manipulable, that's a word, as every other kind of stage in the consultation process. Central Hill Estate did do their own ballot, and they came up with something like 78% of residents want refurbishment and infill, not demolition. And the council simply said, well,
the council did their own.
They did their own ballot, and they came up with 51% of residents.
It's always 51%.
So it's always 51%. And this is happening on
Almost 55.
55. Dramatic emphasis. But you have this again. You have this on the Aylesbury estate. Lots of these estates conduct their own ballots, and they simply get ignored. It's not there to give residents a say. It's there to give councils, I think, a consensus which they can point to and go, you can't complain because you've got your vote on it.
I take entirely what you said about there's key issues around who gets to vote, and the key issues about the timing of it, and that's really, really important. But I certainly think the principle is something that should be really supported, really. The problem, of course, the way that Khan's seems to be drip feeding it in. And also you've got to remember about this is that if you go back to the position 12 months ago, Khan and his team were entirely against ballots. James Murray was in, they didn't want ballots at all. And what's really happened is a shift, and it's a shift in the Labour Party in many ways, in relationship to recognising A, that the current way that estate regeneration is done is problematic, and B, there needs to be a thorough democratisation of the process, because that's simply not what it is. So I think it has been important that actually we've got to this stage, whereas now Civic Kind is actually accepting the principle of ballots basically, and nationally, the Labour Party policy nationally as well, the same with ballots are important.
We were in Germany a couple of days ago talking to a woman about, there's a ladder, it's called Ladder of Citizen Engagement. It's called Ernstein's Ladder of Citizen Participation. At the bottom is manipulation and therapy, i.e. we're doing this for your good. You don't realise it yet, but you will in the end. So these are both non-participatory. Above that is informing, just letting somebody know what you're doing, consultation, and placation, which is deemed to be, they're all tokenistic kind of forms of participation. And the top is deemed to be citizen control, so that's citizen control, delegation and partnership. And I think, there's all this talk about, community-led design, community-led participation and so on. It's got to be about who actually defines what the brief is, who writes the brief, who writes who writes the question about what's the ballot going to be on. Is it, are our homes going to be demolished or nothing? Again, it's like who starts to write those briefs and those questions, and it's got to be the residents from the very start. So again, in this sense, you've got to give the residents a kind of like a way in from the beginning to start to have an agency in the whole process. Otherwise, if you're just asking them a kind of yes or no question at the end of a certain stage of process, it's not genuine engagement. And I think, and what this showed was, again, our approach here was very much about working with residents to try and define a brief, rather than starting with a brief that was given to us from the outset.
I mean, obviously, residents should be balloted. I guess I'm worried about the way it's being presented to them at the moment. For instance, the way the Mayor's presenting it is that there is only one ballot, and it is fixed, and it can't be reversed. And then it's done very, very early on. Lots of these estates conduct their own ballots. And they simply get ignored. So that's a big problem as well. The other one is they want it very early in the process. Now, just to give you an example of why this is a problem, this estate here, Cotton Gardens Estate, has a low-rise component called Knight's Walk. And it's one of the places that first got it started. We kind of got joined. When we were brought in, they were given 3 options, which were all for demolition. We were brought in, we gave an alternative, we managed to get the council to change their mind. And they came up with a partial demolition option. Last time we were kind of involved in the campaign, they were proposing, now this is it's a side part of a bigger estate, so the figures are small, but the proportions can be kind of brought up to an estate of 1,000 homes or more. Originally they were going to demolish 18 homes and replace them with 17 for council rent, and 1 was a freehold property, which they were going to CPO. Then they were going to build 64 proposed additional properties. Now, 25 of those would be for council rent. This is nice. 25 of them would be for council rent. So everyone's like, wow, great, we're actually increasing the council, the council rent. This is just what we need. And 39 for private rent. They thought, residents were like, okay, we'll do that, as long as you don't demolish all our homes. Fast forward to December 2017, suddenly the 17 replacement homes for council rent, 1 freehold, are being reduced down to 14 replacement homes which are called council level rent, of which in the planning document, it's incredible, there is no definition of what a council rent homes is. But let's simply just say, okay, they are going to replace it. Where did those other 3 tenants go, those council tenants? You know where they went. They kicked them off and offered them up over somewhere else. They don't live on the building site. By the time they build this, how many of them will be left? But of the 70 additional properties, now, instead of being for council rent and private rent, 13 are for this new category called tenancy strategy rent homes. That's double social rent. 12 of them are intermediate rent homes. That's 80% market rate. And 45 are now for private sale. Now this has happened in like less than 2 years. And they haven't even, it hasn't even gone to, this is their proposed planning application. This is on a tiny little estate. So if they balloted them on what they were proposing 2 years ago, they said yes to it, there is again nothing in current legislation to stop them doing this as well. Right.
Yeah.
So balloting is really, it's not there to give residents a say, it's there to give councils, I think, a consensus which they can point to and go, you can't complain because we've got your vote on it.
Yeah. And surely there has to be some kind of, ballot arbiter, okay, so this is the residents, ballot, and this is the council ballot. So in terms of legislation, Does there not have to just simply be an independent ballot arbiter to try and make it objective?
I think they are proposing that, aren't they? That there's an independent. And also, very crucially, it says in the mayor's consultation document, it says if the estate community votes against the proposal, they will lose the benefits of regeneration. And the entire good practice guide to estate regeneration understands regeneration as demolition and redevelopment. There's always no mention or provision or funding for what we're trying to do, which is about refurbishment and infill, or just refurbishment. It's either like you take the demolition and redevelopment, or you get nothing. And the role of the architect is very important in mediating between the intentions and desires of the council for demolition and redevelopment, and how they manipulate the residents into accepting that as the only alternative. And it's a very nasty role, I think, that architects play. Architects aren't there merely to design, they're there to present and convince. And in all the documents, the things that come out of the RIBA, out of the GLA, architects are seen as the people who have to be convinced that what is being presented to them is the right choice. And all the legislation is about that. We believe the architect should do it the other way. They should go in, they should say to the developer, whoever it is, how much money have you got? Okay, you've got X. Then they go into the residents, they say, what do you need? All the other community, the surrounding community, what is the housing need in that locale? Then they go, okay, with this amount of money to do this, this is what we can come to. And then they come back to the developer and they say, right, this is what you can do. It's completely reversing the kind of process.
But who pays for the architect?
That's where the money will.
Yeah.
That's the question we have to ask. So maybe you want to bring up, what is the role of the architect in this? How do we get the architect from simply being an instrument of the developer, of the landlord?
I actually have a proposal.
Okay.
Maybe like some legislation could be proposed that the Institute of Architects have to offer some free architectural advice. You know
Well,
what I mean?
like lawyers, they do pro bono work.
Yes, yeah.
What nobody asks, and it's the reason they mention the corporate stuff, is like the price tag is never there of how are we going to make this affordable. And that's the problem that I see with housing, is that the brief is for something that is costed in a way, and nobody's actually saying, this is lovely, but it's too expensive.
I totally agree.
So
Which is
what
the
we
bottom
actually need is to find a way that we can have the world that created this building in, with the social visionary architects who cared about the people they were making things for and how they could make that affordable. How do we bring that back into the picture?
Well, one of the problems of doing cheap architecture in London today is that the land is so expensive.
Yeah.
So even if you cut all the specifications down to the bare bone, you still have to pay for the land. So there is kind of a limit before you have a building that just falls apart on its own.
But on these estates, the land's already in the ownership of the council, so there is no problem with cost of land. But their argument is whether this proposal was not financially viable, because the costs of construction outweigh the 60-year benefits you'll reap through rents. So actually, if our quantity surveyor, I mean, we don't agree with their valuation anyway, because they've not shown us any of the figures. But if we were to say, well, actually, we could build one of these for half of that, then again the argument to say, well, you can't build them, then there is an argument for bringing costs down. I don't think the architecture profession is actually that interested, because essentially we work to a percentage. So, I mean, really, if you work out whatever it is, let's say it's 10% on the cost of the construction. So every time I design a building that costs 250 grand, I take a 25 grand fee off that. So where's the incentive for the architect or designer to really be exploring low-cost construction? There isn't one.
Yeah, but that's why I asked earlier, who's paying for the architect?
Yeah, exactly.
Because, I mean, if you're saying it's much more expensive to demolish and rebuild, that's always going to be what, the business-minded architect is going to choose.
Yeah.
What needs to happen is that local authority given power to tax. That could be through land tax, it could be through various different forms of tax. But we've got one of the lowest levels of tax in Europe, and it's grossly unfair. And there is no shortage of money at all.
Yeah.
There's a shortage of distribution of money.
No shortage of land as well, really.
There's no shortage of land, there's also no shortage of housing. There is a shortage of distribution of housing. And also, I don't actually think it's right to be able to, that one is able to own property here as a non-British resident. I think we should follow the Norwegian system.
The reason why they are different to any other, not any other industry professional, but specifically because they do have a code of conduct.
There's this one code, which I will bore people with briefly, which I always thought was really interesting, and it changed between 2002 and 2010. So the ARB is the Architectural Registration Board, and every architect has to be registered with this board, has to sign up to this bunch of codes. They're quite general. They deal with the kind of your relationship to your clients and being integrity and honesty, all those sorts of things. But there's one specific one which this currently says it's about considering the wider impact of your work. And now it currently says in 2017 edition, where appropriate, you should advise your client how best to conserve and enhance the quality of the environment and its natural resources. That's what it says now. 2002, what it says was, in carrying out or agreeing to carry out professional work, architects should pay due regard to the interests of anyone who may reasonably be expected to use or enjoy the products of their own work. That doesn't exist anymore. The environment is the only thing which is referred to at all in the code. There is no mention of the people who may be affected by the work that you do. And that's enshrined in kind of architectural law, which basically says you don't have any requirements to take into consideration the people who may be affected by the work that you do, which I think is pretty significant.
The code also mentions that you need to take care of your client's money.
Yes, it does. Yeah.
And that's, I think, more than once, and that's become stronger over the years.
But again, who's the client? The client's the person who's paying you. A lot of architects are saying the client is the people who use your product, which is building design.
Hi, I just wanted to comment on that. I did a piece of work for the Bartlett School of Architecture that's got an ethics commission, and I compared the RIBA and the ARB with 55 codes of conduct from other countries.
Wow.
And the really interesting thing is that actually they are the anomaly in being this sort of let's say fair over certain issues. So I think the interesting thing that you're suggesting with how Ash and how we might move is away from this forensic analysis of how to deal with a certain estate, and even when that makes sense on all manner of social, environmental and economic terms, it gets rejected. Lots of countries are moving in a really interesting direction. So the American Institute of Architects has pro bono work built into it now. After lots of lobbying over the last 10 years, they brought it in last year. So that's now recommended. They also have, their code of conduct is split between rules, principles, and I can't remember the biggest one. I'd be really interested in using international examples to be able to demonstrate if we were to get rid of that bit of that legislation or that bit of that code of conduct and replace it with how Germany deals with rent control, how America deals with pro bono work, how Scandinavia deals with co-ops and community land trusts, then you're demonstrating that these aren't insane ideas that aren't realisable. These are actually really easy to implement and actually can be really successful. So I'm really excited about how I perceive you potentially shifting.
The one thing that you're mentioning about this pro bono work is reminding me of what we had in the 1980s, which was actually funded by local authorities, or in London it was the GLC, and it was community technical aid centres. And sometimes we need to remember a bit of history about how things were done in the 1980s when the GLC was doing very different.
So it happened before, it can happen again.
It can happen again. And the idea of looking at other countries, of course it's happening now, many of these things.
Can I say quickly, isn't there a way of using legislation to drive land values down? Because as long as you've got that sort of big disparity between people on the ground and the amount of money that you can actually make with the development, you're always going to get the less unscrupulous local authorities and developers kind of cashing in. if we had legislation to actually limit the use of land or the change of use of land, is that an area that we could actually go down as a way to sort of make land values more realistic?
If you list the building, then the land value will go
If
down.
you list the building,
Yeah.
John Healy.
that's a good story.
Right, so let's get listing.
John Healy came up with the idea that land, if Labour got in, that land would be sold at its value before it had been granted planning permission. Because one of the problems with planning permission is there's huge numbers of developers just buying up land and getting land banking and builders sitting on. I mean, the builders are sitting on. The idea that there's not enough land is ridiculous. The builders are sitting on huge properties, but also the developers are buying it and then spending X number of years getting planning permission for it. It's literally the purest commodity. It's a potentiality. It's not even been used yet. It hasn't even been realised yet. But it's got a potentiality to be built on it, and that's why the land's going up. So definitely legislation will have to change it. I was going to propose the sort of the 4 legislative changes that I've sort of come up with. And if I sat down for longer, I'd probably come up with even more of them. But we've had some, I think was a very good idea. But I was going to if I just read these 4 out. One of them is, the first one is that when proposing an estate regeneration scheme, the social landlord, whether it's a council or a housing association, is legally obliged to set aside sufficient funds for a refurbishment and infill option to be designed and costed by a team of architects, engineers, quantity surveyors and anyone else who's involved, which is independent from the team given the brief for the demolition and redevelopment team. Yeah. But as soon as they go into this, they are legally obliged to give this money across so that you've got an alternative. So that's one idea. One is that an independent team is given funds to produce an impact assessment of the social, financial and environmental costs of demolition and redevelopment for residents. It's the local community and the landlord themselves, and that the findings of this impact assessment are made public before there's any kind of like balloting or resident decision on that. We're always absolutely stunned when we go in, we sort of say, well, have you done an impact assessment, what this can actually do to these people? They're like, no, we'll sort of do that afterwards. You know, when people map the eviction of people. That has to be done first and made, understandable and available for people. Not just the residents, but the council and for the larger wider community, often very affected by this as well. The third one is that enforceable target requirements are set in legislation, not suggested as guidelines in policy, which are set in legislation, define what an estate regeneration is legally bound to do, what its target requires, what it's got to meet, before it receives either GLA funding or, I think, local authority planning permission. Yeah? Unless you meet those requirements in terms of whatever they are, replacement, not these kind of vague terms like replacement or a right to return, which are really meaningless. But that you have to do something. You have to build this, you have to rehouse people, they've got to be able to afford these returns. And this has to be set in legislation, not guidelines. And the final one is that if an estate community votes against a proposed demolition redevelopment scheme, the council then is obliged to carry out the refurbishment and continue, or in most cases restart, the maintenance of the estate, at the very least. And that is, the residents are not reduced to a choice between demolition and being told, we're just going to leave your rooms to rot. So there's a form which I see very practical, legislatively changed, which wouldn't be too hard to write into something like the Good Practice Guide to Estate Regeneration or some other kind of legislative body. I don't know if anyone wants to add anything to those. I hope we do. You kind of suggested some.
What's driving the council? Why
Three.
I mean, what's the...
From the developers.
Yeah,
probably, like section 106 or, those, if you build this much of social housing, then you can reduce the tax.
They're going to own 100% shares in this holding company called Homes for Lambeth, which is then going to subcontract out the construction of private homes or so-called affordable housing and its management.
So maybe that's where the legislation needs to go in, to stop councils making lots of money and kicking tenants out. Because I mean, if you take away the reason then why they want to do it, then suddenly they will love your proposal.
It's not just as simple as saying, oh, the council's all greedy. Estate regeneration works like most things with the carrot and the stick. It becomes a whole lot of, the government kind of withdraws funding, refuses to allow them to borrow against their assets to build new homes, and a whole lot of other legislation. And then they come in, with things like when they say, if you don't make an amount of land available for redevelopment, we will introduce punitive measures. It's bullying. And then they go, but you can do all these other things, like you can set up SPVs and kind of basically privatise all your stock. You can sell it off. You can kick people out. You can call the state brownfield land, stuff like that. It's like most of these things. They kind of open up possibilities, and then they just let capitalism go to work in a way.
Yeah, I just think one of the issues as well is that for a variety of reasons, they want to change the social makeup of the areas that they're dealing with a lot of the time. Now, some of that I think is just a kind of class issue, snobbery, wanting a better class of person in the area. Some of it genuinely is that. Some of it is horrendously corrupt when you look at it, because you find the revolving door where people who work for councils then go and get very well paid jobs with developers. There is a kind of contempt, I think, amongst the councillor class for ordinary working people, and I'm going to define this in a minute. A lot of what we actually come across is older people, pensioners, who are supposed to be being looked after by the state, who suddenly in their later years are being just shat on by the people who are supposed to look after them. But it's also the notion of lower paid workers, and we don't address that one properly. Social rents are genuinely affordable for people who earn the London median income, which is about 20 grand a year. Now, you never hear that when you read the papers. You hear about the average in London, which is somewhere around 35 grand. It's a very skewed figure because of all the millionaires and the billionaires. 50% of the people in this city earn gross £20,000 or less a year. Now, socially rented properties, like what they're proposed to knock down here, are probably involving people in 2-bedroom flats paying £100 or maybe 127. That's affordable.
There's only actually one institution in this country which does legislation, that's called government. So, we can, and I don't disagree with your 4 points, I think they're fantastic, I think the 4 points are excellent. But at the end of the day, the only thing which is going to solve any of this stuff, even slightly.
Oh, I know what you're going to say.
Yeah, well, it's something which approaches a social, a genuinely, you don't have to have a socialist government. You just have to have a genuinely social democratic government, which would put in place many of the things that I'm sure pretty much everyone in this room would want. And I've said this on last week. To be frank, really.
If any of my points were even anywhere near a Labour Party housing policy, it would be great, but it's not.
Look at John.
We need to change it before.
If you look at John Healey's, and I'm not a fan of anyways what he's done, but what we've got to now in relationship to Labour Party housing policy is light years from what it was 20 years ago. Even if half of that is put into practice, then, I'm sorry, but I'll actually be fairly pleased. And to be frank, unless there is this social democratic government, we'll be sitting in halls like this 10, 20 years' time, having the same kind of conversations.
But maybe you might be really right that like changing the legislation it will take so long. And my question is, I'm not from here, but isn't there any one council, one good council who wants to put this in place? And if we could, show this is a successful
People ask us that, and they say, do you know one? We did all the time journalists, there must be one. If you find it, come and tell me.
But the thing is, maybe, so this platform is maybe not to find the resource, but to try to distribute this idea to as many people as possible. That might be the first
I think that's a
thing.
good idea. And also, it is worth saying that if we can define councils that are worst by their behaviour, then by that very basis,
there must be some that are the least bad.
Yeah.
So, you know, we're not going to look to Southwark for any solutions. We're not going to look to Lambeth for any solutions.
But you're right.
We're not going to look to
There's
Tower
definitely
Hamlets.
worse. There's definitely worse. I mean, Kingston is, you know, terrible stuff. All I'll say is that no government has ever gone in and made their policies better. And before Jeremy Corbyn gets in, or as I like to call him, Jeremy Corbyn. Before Jeremy Corbyn gets in, we need to change.
Labour's, if he gets in, we need to change his housing policy because at the moment it's a mess. It's terrible. I don't agree. Well, I don't personally agree with you that even half of it is good. It's all about affordable housing. It's predicated on estate demolition. I think it needs to change.
This is the,
I'm going to get up to why. I just wanted to do my do you want to?
Sorry, it's just I'm in Westminster, but Kensington and Chelsea is the next. So it's the Grenfell area. We had a hustings last week with the Labour Party, and we absolutely pinned them down to say you will not get rid of any social housing, no demolition. It's on, it's been filmed, but it's one of those places, because of Grenfell, it's given us a lot of power over things.
Sorry, are the Green Party quite good on the housing policy? I don't know.
Unfortunately, we did ask the Green Party to cook it, but I don't think what was really important. Because they gave us lots of money for food, which is really we end on that note, actually. This one round has some food. Thank you very much for coming tonight and talking with us, and we'll follow this up.